going to start with a question that came in from Claire O'Grady for you, Beth. The question is, on the backdrop of the COVID pandemic, how do we ethically address these global challenges in class whilst taking cognizance of societal, community and family grief and loss, and crucially, without exacerbating this ongoing, far-reaching emotional mental crisis that is bubbling under? There's a nice, huge question for you, Beth. What do you make of that?
Yeah, well, fantastic question, and I could take up all the time by just probably focusing on that one on its own, but it's great to be asked something like that, because you can't try to get to some of these issues without sort of ranging into all of these other issues as well. You have to be sort of look at it in the round too. So I mean, there's lots of ways to consider this, and I think any of the issues around, if we're looking at sustainability, these complex issues, they're going to provoke or perhaps draw forward issues that make us feel challenged, make us feel uncomfortable. This is both teacher and learner for students as well. Everyone that's involved in this, issues that will feel disruptive in some way and feel challenging, make us feel uncomfortable perhaps. And I don't think that in itself is necessarily a problem. I think we need to be able to feel uncomfortable in a sense, but you don't necessarily want to get to the point where it becomes a crisis, an emotional and mental health crisis. And so I think some ways in which I would say that we try to think about this in practice would be perhaps to think about what issues we raise, what issues we feel comfortable raising. And again, we were just talking there about professional judgment. It wouldn't be for me to say, this is what you should raise, X, Y, and Z within a class in the context. But what I would say is that we're starting to think about this. We need to look at practice in an individual sense in terms of really looking at the community, really looking at where your school is based. And that's where I would start to think of, how could you work in an outdoor sense, outdoors being beyond the classroom and into sort of the living world, the world beyond the classroom, to see what are the issues that might be raised there, what might be issues that are important as starting points for young people, for our learners, whoever they are, or for ourselves as people involved in education, for us to feel comfortable to get engaged with, to start with, and from there start to explore, rather than sort of bring in perhaps issues that are perhaps abstract or maybe not rooted within the warp and weft, the fabric of the society in which the school is placed. And when I say things like outdoors, what I don't mean is that we need to be looking to green spaces, but we need to be looking to woodlands and babbling brooks and all of that. What I mean is going into what are the issues that feel perhaps real, and that's where it may become troubling in a way that we maybe want to get to something that feels disruptive but not challenging to the point of being particularly uncomfortable. But that's where we might get to some of those
Beth, you have frozen on my screen. I'm just letting you know. I'm going to see if everyone's nodding. Oh, Beth's back.
Sorry.
She's back.
Yeah, sorry. That always happens at these crucial points.
We're well used to it by now.
Fantastic. So maybe I'll just stop, just sort of kind of summarize at that point. But it's more trying to think of starting points that come from the local context in which the school is placed, the community issues that are maybe driven by our learners as well. That might be a way to start. I'll stop there in case there's any comeback on that or points raised.
Thank you. Well, if there are any comments on that, what Beth has offered there, please just add it in the chat and we'll weave it into the conversation. And let's go to James now to introduce another layer and see where that takes us. James, I'm going to do something terrible and combine two questions together, so bear with me. So somebody has asked James that your provocation ends with the question, what can and should teachers do about the conflict between their commitment to social justice and the reality of an unjust society? What has your own experience and your observations of others shown you about how teachers work with this conflict in real life? And I'm weaving in someone else who's asked you, what one thing would you change to the current system? to have the effect that you think is needed? Is that really cruel? There's like about 1 million questions there. Sorry, James. Oh, we can't hear you. You're on. Try again. Press the magic button.
There we go.
There we go.
This time. Okay, so yeah, I'll give it a go, I suppose. So I suppose the first one was asking about sort of my experience or how I kind of feel that I've seen or talked to sort of how teachers deal with this. Generally, my experience of this is that this is something that huge numbers of teachers find hugely frustrating, sometimes in ways they're not entirely sure how to express, because it doesn't necessarily come up in the usual kind of vocabulary of their sort of day-to-day stuff and the pressure of it. The general approach is the thing that we all do, isn't it? You know, you try and grab little victories where you can. You help that one student with an extra couple of minutes because it, you know, that's kind of, at least it feels like what you're meant to be doing. And then you fight for the bigger fights if and when they come along. You know, a curricular review or a new funding stream becomes available or something like that. But I'm of the view that I think this tension that sits underneath all of this, I think it's one of the big underlying tensions that actually pushes really good teachers to the edges of or even out of the system. And that's one of the things that I've become sort of increasingly aware of over the years, certainly in the last few years. I've watched people who are brilliant, you know, leave the profession early and things like that. And I think this is definitely part of it. What would I change about it? I think one of the big things that really bothers people in the profession is the feeling that they are prevented from or blocked from or scared into not speaking publicly and engaging with these things publicly. And to be completely frank with you, my entire, you know, I'm not in here today because I'm an English teacher. I'm in here today because of my other work. That entire career is built on this thing about teachers not being able to speak publicly. A lot of what I do is basically just try to tell non-teachers what teachers are saying and thinking and feeling. So for me, a way of protecting teachers and encouraging them to engage with these issues publicly could be really valuable. And I think I quite often like to think in terms of like catalyst policies, and I think this could be one of them. So that kind of general catch-all that's used, that you bring the council into disrepute, that needs to be completely overruled by a professional commitment to ethics, to ethical education, and frankly, to the students that we serve, because they are the ones that we should be, who are our responsibility. But even that being said, there's a big political aspect to this. Part of the reason teachers feel they can't speak out publicly is down to politicians and the kind of culture that they've created around education, which means that one of the things that would have to be done is for Scotland to get better politicians. And I am not enormously optimistic about that. And just as one wee final thing, because people have mentioned it with the national discussion, I am not remotely convinced that the national discussion is, or the so-called national discussion, is likely to move us any closer to solving any of this either.
James, what do you think could have been done with the national discussion that would have given you assurance that it would be moving in the right direction? What does it lack from your point of view?
I think it would have been good if it had been both national and a discussion. Would have been my sort of main thing, I think. It's been neither. It's not a discussion. It's basically everyone can see the direction that we wanted to go in. It was sparked by an attempt to keep everybody from noticing the detail in the OECD report. That's why it started with the SQA being killed off. So it's not really national. It's not anything really to do with what it should be, which is a genuine national reconsideration of what education is and what its future should be. But frankly, and I've said this to several officials, if you walked out into any street in Scotland and asked them about the national discussion for education, would you get a single person who even knew what it was? Of course not. It's nonsense. What should have been happening is a big long-term project, not something that was going to get rattled through in 6 months. It should have been, I think education reform is always a 5 to 10 year project, and this should have started on that basis. Not a discussion itself, but at least a couple of years. And it had to actually go round the country in person. It had to go out and actively engage people, not open a website and say, send us some answers to some questions. all of that is a complete waste of time. And in my view, I am a cynic, but in my view, it's a pretty deliberate waste of time as well. This is what you would do if you wanted to be, if you wanted to look like you were interested in reform while also preventing serious reform. I think what we're doing just now is pretty much the kind of approach that you would go for.
Thank you, James. I can see Gert listening to that with interest. Gert, what's your thoughts? Have you got any reflections on reform, long-term educational policy?
I tend to agree with James that this takes time. And therefore I also have some doubts about this project of a national conversation, that it's too quick, that it's online. And when I looked at the questions, I thought those are not even the questions I think we should be asking. Now you can say it's a nice attempt, but it's far more difficult, I think, to do that. And these cycles are very long. Also because if you want to change something before it really lands in education, you are close to the next generation. And it's really important to be mindful of that as well, which makes it difficult for politicians to score because they work actually in much shorter time frames. And that's a particular difficulty of the educational policy environment that I see in many countries. And I would probably say if education and educators don't take a voice in that, then you can wait for the politicians as long as you want. So there is some importance in keeping these conversations also going from other angles and directions, like this one, or like James's publications.
Thanks, Gert. And I can see that Roseanne, has put a piece in the chat there that's not dissimilar. It speaks to this. It's where does the space come to hear the voices, to have the conversations, to make the change collectively go forward. So I think there's an ongoing challenge for us, and it's certainly in my head about this particular piece of work. How do you keep that alive? You know, how do you keep the space for that to keep talking? So while we've been talking about politicians and change and systems and what they like to look at, Alan, one of the things you would say is obsession with data and what it's used for. So here's a question for you. Do you think the focus on and use of data as it is currently experienced within Scottish education is ethical? So just a wee small question there, and supports the values of social justice, particularly with regards to tackling poverty and class disadvantage. And the question goes on to ask, really, what do you see as the barriers in that space to making a culture shift around about data and how it aligns with our values?
I think the answer is no. It doesn't promote social justice. It reinforces the inequalities within the system. That we collect what we can collect, to run it through spreadsheets, to produce league tables that say school X is good and school Y is bad. And to be perfectly honest, we could probably all sit down and do that without even having the spreadsheet. We could just work out, these are the middle class schools where these kids are going to do well in the main. These are the working class schools where the kids are going to do really badly. And then these are the very, very poor schools in the communities I used to work in. And no matter how hard teachers work, their kids will not overcome the societal barriers that are put in their way to attain. The other point for me, I think, though, is around what we as a profession ask and what do we want from it, is that most people go into teaching across the piece because they want to teach a subject, and they're concerned about how they teach that subject rather than the broader context of giving people the skills they need for lifelong learning, the skills that are not necessarily subjectly orientated. We tend to teach then towards gaining a qualification, and that's then what we measure. How many people get that qualification, whether that qualification has any real use, in inverted commas, or not. And for me, I think one of the things as professional educators we need to consider is, what part do we play in creating the PI-driven system? What part do we play in because we like subjects, does that then give politicians a means of identifying attainment? And the next point for me is around how we actually then measure the acquisition of skills and knowledge. And James and I were having a bit of a laugh about that. And the private meeting is, as someone from a college background, fully sold on criterion referenced assessment. Then you can demonstrate the skills and knowledge that you have. You take away that ability to manipulate the bell curve, because either you can demonstrate the skill set or you can't. And then you can then offer people access to the qualifications at a level they're likely to be successful for, build the skills to be effective learners, and help them, and then create platforms for the transitions to the next stage if they wish to do so, whether it be in school or whether it be afterwards when they've been in work. And we need to look at that. We play our part in keeping that system going by supporting the SQA, by not challenging the Big Bang exam, by not saying to employers and universities, it's not our job to grade people so that it makes your job easier. You need to get recruitment and selection procedures focused to give you the kind of people you need for the courses or jobs that you want. So I think there's a bit for us. We can blame everybody for running a spreadsheet, but we've got a role to argue against that spreadsheet and then to say, and here are our alternatives. This is what we think will make a difference. I also, just to get back to James's point about and Gert's point as well about political cycles. Our political system doesn't encourage consensus. So it's impossible virtually to have a 5 to 15 to 20-year plan to fundamentally change education, because politicians get elected in a short space of time. And if you think about how the reform piece started off in Scotland, and Ken's report's brilliant, I think everyone here would say Ken's got a vision we could probably sign up to most of it at any one point. But as soon as you start to say we're going to do away with the hire, the Daily Mail's on your case, and no matter what anyone thinks, Daily Mail readers vote in substantial numbers and influence Scottish politicians. Then you've got the middle classes in general, even if they don't read the Daily Mail, in flight. So they'll be causing bother. But the people who would be best served by change have no voice. They're ignored. And that's the fundamental problem. The national discussion didn't include very many people from the communities I used to work in. The national discussion wasn't about education. It was about what happened in a school. It didn't involve what happened in a college. It didn't involve what happened in CLD until we actually jumped up and down and banged the table. We continually talk about Scottish education if it is only about school and then potentially the transition to university. We never talk about how the totality of the system, how the system works together. But until we do that, there'll be, in 20 years' time, there'll be another group like this having similar discussions as to why these set of reforms failed to deliver the promise of Ken's report. Right.
Thanks, Alan. You almost got me on my drum there about definitions, because we talk about education when we mean school and we mean or schooling. I think there's some distinctions, but there's a question coming from Michael. Sorry, Michael, I don't know your last name. It says, to what extent can a democratic approach to schools address issues of ethics raised by the provocations? Now, Gert, you have written lots about the democratic role of what being a teacher is and feels like. Are there any reflections you would offer to Michael?
I'll give a very quick response.
Go for it.
Because sometimes we think that democracy is about giving everyone a voice and then going with where the biggest group of voices is. But we should never forget that at the heart of democracy are two values, equality and freedom, and they are always in tension. And then there is also the value of solidarity. And if we say that looking at what happens in schools or colleges or educational settings through the question of equality and the question of freedom and the tension between the two, and then the challenge of solidarity, then you have a very important frame to address some of these issues. But we should be very mindful that democracy is different from just saying, let's give everyone a voice and then we have democracy. I would call that populism.
I love it when you come in with something like that very close to the end of a meeting. That's really fun for us. That just makes me want to do another one of these. But so I think we're coming almost to the end of our time together. I think we were hoping to finish about 5:15 because we know that a lot of folk have hung on and stuck with us after 5 o'clock. I'm going to spin very quickly around Beth, James and Alan just to see if there are any parting words that they would like to offer from the things that the conversation has led this afternoon. Gert, I'll then come to you for a couple of reflections before we close. So if folk can stay with us for that closing, that would be much appreciated. And Beth, would you like to go first?
Yeah, thank you. I just want to make a point. We've talked about opportunities for discussion. We've talked a lot about, well, we're having lots of discussion. We've also had this backdrop of sort of the time needed for reform, as it might be, to come in as well. And I'd just like to pick up on that and say that we have to move quickly. We're in a state of urgency. We're taking some issues of sustainability seriously in terms of crisis, loss of biodiversity, loss of species, and so on. There is an urgency that we have to move quickly. We're taking this seriously, balanced against the need to have these discussions, because firing forward without plan or without thought or without critical response to these issues will not help. So it's trying to get that balance, but it's just making the case for we need to think quick. We are in a state of crisis, so we need to be mindful of that if you're thinking of policy and political response, which is slow or fast in terms of the cycles, but slow in terms of the impact.
So well thought through long-term policy, but quick action associated with that, and time and space to do that really well. Yeah. Thanks, Beth. I'm going to come to Alan because I think James is trying to get back into the meeting. Alan, do you want to go next? Was there any parting thoughts for us?
Can not be surprised as someone who's worked a lot in the community-based setting, as I'm a great fan of Paulo Freire. So I think this quote is maybe something in the light of where we are just now is useful. The future isn't hidden in a corner. The future is something we build in the present. And I think that that's what we need to do. Mark Priestley at Stirling University talks about teacher agency, and he means it across the piece. He actually means educational practitioner agency. And I think that that's what we need to develop. We need to take control, or as much control as we possibly can, and influence in a way that's not seen as being protecting the profession as such, but the one that's more open in the line of the discussions that we've had. How do we create a more inclusive education system that people benefit from, drop in, drop out of, move along, move across the continuum? So for me, that's it. We have responsibility to build the future, because it's, if we don't build it, someone else is going to have to do it in the next present, as it were. So that's been my comment.
That was a little bit Barack Obama, if you don't mind me saying, Alan. We are the people we have been waiting for. So over to James. James, any parting thoughts for us?
I suppose something that I've thought about it before, but it's come up again today with various contributions, is this idea of how you pursue these kind of changes or any kind of educational reform within structures with ethical barriers and obviously with these kind of political barriers. I think part of the solution to all of it has to be about finding a way to sort of extricate education from 4 and 5 year electoral cycles. And I can't really see any way that you do that without very explicitly setting out to build a democratic mandate for education reform that's distinct from political parties. That is why I was so disappointed with the national discussion covers, whatever phrase I didn't use in my book is the one that they used. So whichever phrase it was, that's why I was so disappointed by it, because actually that is the process by which you could build a genuine democratic mandate that would last long beyond a single parliament. But I understand why politicians don't like it, because they want to stay in control, but it really is the only way to actually make things better, is to achieve that, is that refreshed democratic mandate for change. The kind of thing Curriculum for Excellence was kind of built on. You know, there was no idea, there was no prospect of changing government was going to derail that. But that's what we're looking for again, but it's going to be harder to do it now because of the polarised state of Scottish politics.
Thank you, James. And let's hear from you, Gert. Any reflections? And you're allowed to advertise your book of teacher agency that you wrote with Mark Priestley.
Okay,
You're allowed to do a wee free advert for that.
Good. A few final comments, and also a cheeky plug in the chat to a paper that just came out yesterday, I think, which is a comment on the Muir report as well, and the whole question of present and future. So maybe 3 or 4 points. I think it's fantastic to have these conversations. I'm originally from the Netherlands, where the teaching profession has still not managed to get its act together. And even up to 2 years ago was strongly disagreeing even about what it means to be a teacher, let alone to have any grown-up conversations about values and direction. So although this is not perfect, I think it's quite something that this is possible in Scotland. So that's one thing to keep that in perspective. Part of this started with the whole question of the COPAC, the Code of Professionalism and Conduct. And I think, yeah, also listening to all the contributions today and in previous sessions, there is an interesting question: does the field need 2 documents or 1? Does it need a COPAC and a standard, or can it all be together? And Pauline, you said nicely, some people say the code is for bad teachers and the standard for good teachers. And that's, you can say, too simple, but I'm still in 2 minds about what we should do. When I look at the standard, I would say it's a bit too ethical. There are so many values that I begin to wonder, where is education? What should teachers do with all these values? When I look at the code, I would say it's a bit too behavioral, and it could do with a bit more ethics and a bit more politics. So I think that there's work to do there. For me, one question is, where is education in this discussion? Because we can easily say, and we say that with a lot of integrity, education for sustainability, education for social justice. But there is the big question, what can education do there? And if we think that education can solve all the problems, then before we know it, we are burdening ourselves with issues that maybe are for other people. This remains my problem with the poverty-related attainment gap. If you are concerned about poverty, address poverty. If you're concerned about an attainment gap, you can fix the attainment gap, but it probably won't address inequality and poverty. So these big ambitions need some unpacking to ask what can education do then. And then maybe about the future of the code. I think the code is important because it's a document about public accountability, about trust in the profession. And I have one little suggestion. What if we rewrite the code, which is now in the second person singular, you should, you must, and rewrite it in the first person plural and say, we want, we stand for. For me, that would be a very different way to position the code and say, we take ownership of the things we want to stand for to do education well. And my 5th point is to be continued. I think there is always urgency, but it's really important also to have a discursive and reflective space like this. So that's some quick comments on what I think is a valuable and yeah, really important conversation.
Thank you so much, Gert, and thank you so much, Beth and James and Alan. We really do appreciate the efforts people go to think through what they want to say and make it all happen. So we really appreciate it. I just want to finish today by saying that we've learned a lot at GTC Scotland about this process, about speaking in this way. It's not perfect, speaking with 60 people on a screen, but we're learning about how you create really good policy isn't starting with the policy and rewriting it. It's about having these kinds of conversations. I agree with you, Gert. This isn't a finished conversation, and we need to get the feedback, take stock, decide where we go next. I think as well, what we have learned is there's policy, and then there's myths and legends about policy, and then there's lethal mutations about what happens when that policy is used in particular contexts that we really need to understand. So I think we need to think forward, what the policy context looks like with regard to code and standards. That's significant, that's huge. There's a lot more conversation that needs to happen in that place. And that means we need a bit of stability too, as we have those conversations, because one thing we have to be sure is people understand what the status quo is with regard to policy document. So there's more for us to think about how we have these types of conversations, and we welcome feedback from anybody that's been involved about how we might go about doing that. A big, huge thank you for everybody for coming along. The Padlet will remain open. Now, someone will correct me if I'm wrong. I think until tomorrow morning, the Padlet will remain open. So if you wish to add any thoughts now that you've heard some more conversation, please just go in and do that, so that, because that's really useful to gather hugely valuable information that we're gathering. And I think I'll leave it there and thank you. Let you get your tea at nearly 5:30. And a huge thanks, Beth, James, Alan, Gert, thank you so much. And thanks to all of you. Take care. See you soon.